want to turn now to somebody who's been to a Washington dinner party or two and is probably in tune to the conversation that Matthew brought up at the start of that interview. That's Greg Stohr. He covers the Supreme Court for us here at Bloomberg News. Greg, let me go right there if I could. How much is this something that folks in Washington, lawyers and others, are talking about? How do you think of that in light of the way that the president reacts to the decisions that we saw in the last few weeks of the court's term?
So good morning to you both. Thanks for exaggerating my social life, David.
Not at all. Not at all.
You know, it has been a topic, a big topic throughout this Trump term. We have seen both the president and other administration officials talking about the possibility of ignoring the courts. Now, for the most part, that has happened with the lower courts so far. There has not been a case of outright defiance of the Supreme Court. And in fact, with all these decisions of this term, most of which went Trump's way, some of which went against him, we haven't seen any outright defiance. And so I suppose, you know, in this very difficult time for this nation with so much division, perhaps we can say that's a good sign that we didn't see outright defiance.
President Trump does really have an affinity for Andrew Jackson, but you're right. So far, I do want to ask you about these two cases we were talking to in the lead up to these decisions, and that is the Slaughter case and the Cook case, because when we were speaking earlier, you said that they would probably have to be issued together because they were similar, but it looked like based on oral arguments, and this is where it ended up, the court would go one way with one and one way with the other. So why, can you talk to us about whether you think the court in their arguments successfully skirted that complication and managed to lay out justifications for why in one case they expanded presidential power and said the president can fire the head of the FTC, and in another case said, well, not quite yet on Lisa Cook, and here's why.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is probably just that the court said the Fed is different. And to put a little more on that, the Fed is different because of its role in setting monetary policy and the history and the tradition of the institution. Now, the court kind of skirted some questions like, well, what about the functions of the Fed that are a lot like other executive branch agencies, the regulation of banks, for example? But the court did draw a line that says the Fed is not an institution where the president can fire people for any reason. Now, having said that, when we got into the issue of, okay, Donald Trump says he has a reason for firing Lisa Cook, the alleged mortgage fraud that she denies, the court essentially said, okay, we're going to protect the Fed to some degree for the time being. There's a lot of tough questions in here. There's questions about what kind of process she is entitled to before the president does that. And there's definitely a lot of questions about what is enough to constitute cause. That is, enough reasons the president could fire her. Not at all clear which way it will come out ultimately in this case.
You've written a new piece kind of looking at the takeaways from this last term, and there's a line that stood out to me. That's President Trump has built the Supreme Court supermajority, but it was the Reagan revolution that prevailed during the just completed term. Talk a bit about what we learned, if you would, Greg, about this court, about the decisions it made during this term and how it's likely to rule going forward. What did we learn about the court as an institution over the course of this last term?
Well, first of all, it was a really, really big term in terms of shifting the law. So you look at things like the Voting Rights Act decision. You look at that decision we were just talking about, letting the president fire the heads of independent agencies and sort of undercutting the legal basis for the modern administrative state. And most of those things are longstanding conservative priorities. They were priorities that when people were in the Reagan administration, as John Roberts and Sam Alito were, they were working on those ideas. They were developing them. And so this is kind of the culmination of a legal movement on those issues that has built up over decades. The places where the president lost tended to be things that were more his priorities, not things that conservatives have hoped for decades and decades. So you look at birthright citizenship, which came up very, very recently, the restrictions he tried to impose there. And certainly you look at tariffs, which has not been a conservative priority. And the Supreme Court shot down the notion that this law that doesn't mention tariffs but talks about emergency powers could let the president impose hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs. So it all told, yes, Donald Trump won significant wins this term, but they were not on those things that were sort of Trump-specific, MAGA-specific.
I'm glad you brought up birthright citizenship because I did want to talk about that. It was a 6-3 decision that upheld birthright citizenship, but there was a concurring opinion by one of the conservative justices. Explain to us what it did. It kind of said, yes, I agree with this decision, but for a different reason. And if you did it this way, and like it was almost like a head fake. If you went through Congress, this might be a different opinion. And now all of a sudden the president has said, hey, maybe he will work through Congress on this. Explain to us what the argument was there and if you think we're going to have to revisit this again next term.
Yeah, so that was an opinion by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and you're exactly right. He agreed with the result, but not the reasoning. So the key language in the Constitution that the court interpreted was the 14th Amendment, which says if you're born in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you are a citizen. And there are a couple federal statutes that have the exact same language. And so what Justice Kavanaugh said in his concurrence was, I disagree with the majority about what the Constitution means. But because Congress passed those statutes at a time when everybody understood that language to mean that anybody born in the U.S. was a citizen, I'm going to say that by statute, the president cannot impose these restrictions. And thus, all Congress needs to do is change that statute, and the president would have that authority. Now, the problem for Justice Kavanaugh is it's not clear, not at all clear, he's got 5 votes on the court to do that. The majority pretty clearly said we see it as a constitutional right, a constitutional value that if you're born here with a few very small exceptions, you are an American citizen.
Greg, let's look ahead if we could. So at the end of the term, we learned what the court's going to be considering next, and I'm sure you heard Lisa a few moments ago talking about the New York Times reporting that the administration wants to relax some firearms restrictions. A couple of cases here stand to deal with that issue as well, Viramontes versus Cook County and Grant versus Higgins. There are municipalities, places around the country that have certain restrictions on assault weapons, and I gather that's what the court's going to be weighing here. What insight can you give us into sort of the crux of those cases and sort of what the court's going to be looking into here in the next term?
Sure. Yeah, the court has in recent years imposed much tougher rules governing restrictions on guns. So they've made it much harder for a state or local government to say we are doing this in the name of gun safety. The lower courts have generally said that states and local governments can ban so-called assault weapons, that those aren't protected under the Second Amendment. The court has really sort of hemmed and hawed about taking up this issue. 3 justices previously said, 3 conservative justices, Gorsuch, Thomas, and Alito, have said, we want to take this up. Justice Kavanaugh has said, I think I want to take it up, but not just yet. And by the way, I'm really skeptical of these restrictions. And so probably those 4 provided the 4 votes to take up the issue. And what that means is when the court hears arguments in the fall, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett are likely to be the 2 votes, and it is going to be a hugely important case, a very closely watched case because, of course, of the impact that, both because of how widespread semi-automatic so-called assault weapons are and because of the way they have been used in many, many mass shootings.
Greg, before we let you go, we've only got about a minute left. I do want to ask you, there was some drama about the potential retirement of Samuel Alito. What happened there? It turned out to be not true, but do you think it was just possibly too early? Are you expecting some sort of retirement this fall, particularly if Republicans lose control of the Senate?
So yes, there was an erroneous report that the court had announced that Justice Alito was retiring. The court had not done so. No indication. It seems very clear he's not retiring right now. He's not retiring in the next few days. A lot of people have started talking about, well, what is possible? Would Justice Alito retire then? You can't totally rule it out. We're all going to be watching it very closely. It would be, from the court standpoint, hugely different from any other retirement, at least in the modern era. Justices don't retire because of an election. They retire at the end of a term. Yes, they think about who is in the White House and who might replace them. But for Justice Alito to retire, or any other justice to retire just because of the outcome of the midterms, would be a very new thing. Having said that, if Democrats take the Senate, it's entirely possible it'll be a long time before a conservative replacement could be confirmed. Sure.